May 15, 1943. The air inside the New Guinea jungle was heavy enough to choke a man, a stifling blanket of humidity that trapped the heat and the stench of rotting vegetation. Under the dense canopy, where the afternoon sun only pierced through in scattered golden shafts, Sergeant James Whitehorse of the United States Army crouched motionless over a patch of wet earth. To the 5 exhausted soldiers standing behind him, sweat stinging their eyes and their uniforms clinging to their skin like second layers of mud, there was nothing there. Just another divot in the endless sludge of the rainforest floor, indistinguishable from 1,000 others they had stepped over that day. They were ready to call it quits. This was their 18th patrol, and like the previous 17, it seemed destined to end in failure. Empty hands, blistered feet, and no sign of the phantom enemy supply depot intelligence swore was hidden in these mountains. Before we unravel this mystery, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments if you think you could survive a week in the jungle. It helps the channel immensely. What none of the men realized, not even the West Point educated officer leading them, was that the Apache tracker's unconventional interpretation of this single, muddy depression was about to unravel a deception so sophisticated it had fooled Allied reconnaissance planes and local informants for 4 months. James Whitehorse was an anomaly in the Southwest Pacific. He had arrived only 6 weeks earlier, one of 14 Native American soldiers specifically recruited for a skill set that modern military academies had largely forgotten: traditional tracking. Born on the Fort Apache Reservation in Arizona, the son of a cattle rancher, Whitehorse had been raised on the teachings of his grandfather, a man known as he who sees what others miss. While other boys learned to read primers, Whitehorse learned to read the earth. His grandfather taught him that the ground was a manuscript, and every living thing that moved across it left a story. A bent blade of grass was a sentence. A displaced pebble was a paragraph. But here, in the green hell of New Guinea, the stories were being erased by an enemy that had turned camouflage into an art form. The Japanese forces in this sector were ghosts. They built underground bunkers that vanished into the root systems of giant banyan trees and supply lines that looked like game trails. Allied intelligence had intercepted radio chatter confirming a massive depot in the Finisterre Range. Yet 23 patrols over 14 weeks had found absolutely nothing. Captain Richard Morrison, wiping sweat from his brow, watched Whitehorse with a mix of desperation and skepticism. Morrison commanded Easy Company and had led 9 of those failed patrols personally. He knew military tactics, flanking maneuvers, and logistics, but he was fighting an enemy that refused to exist on his terms. Whitehorse remained frozen for nearly 2 minutes. His eyes did not focus on one spot, but scanned the mud in a soft focus, looking for disruptions in the natural texture of the soil. Finally, he stood up, turning to Morrison with a look that was not triumph, but rather a quiet, dark amusement. When Morrison asked what he had found, Whitehorse's answer sounded like a riddle. He said someone had walked backward through this mud, stepping carefully into existing footprints to hide their passage. But in their effort to be invisible, they had made a mistake, a microscopic error in physics that only a lifetime of hunting would notice. Morrison stepped closer, his pulse quickening. What kind of mistake? Whitehorse knelt again, beckoning the captain down into the mud. He pointed to the depression. He explained that when a man walks forward naturally, the heavy impact of the stride lands on the heel, digging it deepest into the soft earth. But when a man walks backward, trying to retrace steps, he cannot land on his heel blindly. He must land on his toes to find his footing and balance his weight before committing the step. The weight distribution reverses. This print, Whitehorse pointed out, was deep at the toe, but pointed away from the mountains toward the Allied lines. To the untrained eye, it looked like a soldier walking home. To Whitehorse, it screamed that someone was walking into the mountains while desperately trying to look like they were leaving. Private Tommy Chin, the unit's interpreter, leaned in closer to examine the mud. Chun was a city kid from San Francisco, a world of concrete and steel, where tracking meant following the route of a streetcar or navigating a grid of city blocks. The subtlety of what Whitehorse was describing, the biomechanics of a heel strike versus a toe strike, seemed almost supernatural to him. He asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How could the sergeant be so certain this was not just an odd gait or a soldier with a limp? Whitehorse did not answer with words. Instead, he stood and moved 30 yards up the trail, pointing out 6 more faint impressions. Each one told the same impossible story. Toe-heavy, deep indentations that pointed towards the Allied base, yet formed a sequence that moved backward toward the enemy, held interior. No man walks like this by accident, Whitehorse said quietly. It is deliberate. It is difficult. And it means they are working very hard to make us believe this trail is an exit, not an entrance. The realization sent a chill through the patrol that had nothing to do with the damp jungle air. They were not just chasing a rumor anymore. They were walking into a manufactured reality. Captain Morrison immediately ordered a defensive perimeter and radioed battalion headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Hayes, a hardened veteran of the North Africa campaign, who had learned that unconventional intelligence often yielded the best results, authorized the pursuit, but insisted on reinforcing the team. While they waited for the additional squad, Whitehorse turned his attention from the mud to the greenery. The jungle here was a chaotic wall of vines, ferns, and towering hardwoods, but Whitehorse noticed a pattern that was too orderly to be natural. He showed the men how certain branches had been trimmed, not hacked, to create clear sight lines at specific intervals. It was a corridor of negative space, invisible unless you were looking for it. The Japanese had not just walked here. They were maintaining this trail to look abandoned while using it as a highway. They were gardening the jungle to hide their war machine. By late afternoon, the reinforced patrol moved inland, following a route that contradicted every survival instinct they had. They were walking deeper into the green hell, following a trail of backward footprints into terrain that grew increasingly vertical and treacherous. The psychological toll was immediate. In 1943, the Japanese soldier was often mythologized as a Superman of the jungle, an enemy who could survive on a handful of rice and disappear into the foliage. Now Morrison's men felt like they were walking into the throat of that beast. The rain began to fall, a tropical deluge that threatened to wash away the subtle signs Whitehorse was following. But the Apache sergeant had already switched his focus. He was no longer looking for footprints. He was tracking the deception itself. Shortly after noon on the second day, the jungle gave up its first concrete secret. Private First Class Michael O'Brien, a Boston construction worker, tripped over a hard, metallic edge protruding from the mud. It was the corner of an ammunition crate, weathered and half buried, its Japanese markings still legible. Sergeant Tanaka, the Nisei translator attached to the unit, wiped the mud from the stenciling. Inside had been 75 millimeters shells ammunition for the Type 88 anti-aircraft gun. The discovery was baffling. Intelligence had reported 0 anti-aircraft positions in this sector. The Type 88 was a heavy, formidable weapon, not something dragged through miles of mountain jungle for a skirmish. If the Japanese were hauling this caliber of firepower up here, they were not just hiding a few supplies. They were protecting something massive. Furthermore, Whitehorse noted the crate's placement. It was buried awkwardly, far from the logical path of ascent. It was a breadcrumb, deliberately placed to suggest that any Japanese force had moved east, away from the true destination. They were being guided by an invisible hand, manipulated by an enemy who had turned the landscape into a theater of lies. Morrison looked at the towering, mist-shrouded peaks ahead. Somewhere up there, the enemy was waiting, and they had brought big guns. The patrol continued their ascent, clawing their way through terrain that seemed to actively resist their presence. The jungle floor here was a tangle of slick roots and rotting logs, the air thick with a buzzing of insects that feasted on sweat and open sores. The backward footprints had long since vanished, washed away by the relentless tropical rains. But Whitehorse was navigating by a different set of cues now. A sapling bent at an unnatural angle, a rock dislodged and moss not yet regrown on its underside. The subtle thinning of vegetation that suggested a path kept clear by frequent use. On the afternoon of the third day, the deception evolved from footprints to landscape architecture. Private Chun halted the column, pointing to a small clearing about 50 feet across. To the untrained eye, it was just another patch of jungle reclaim, choked with vines and scattered with dead leaves. But as the men moved closer, the chaos resolved into order. Beneath the carefully scattered debris were rows of taro and sweet potato. Vines had been woven through the crops to break up their silhouette from the air, and weeds were allowed to grow in strategic clusters to mimic neglect. It was a garden, large enough to supplement the rations of 100 men, disguised as a patch of wilderness. Captain Morrison radioed the discovery to battalion headquarters, his voice tight. A concealed garden meant a permanent garrison. They were dangerously close to an occupied position, likely within a few hundred yards. Colonel Hayes ordered extreme caution and dispatched 2 more platoons, but they were hours away. The patrol was effectively alone. Whitehorse urged them forward, but his movement was slower now, more predatory. He whispered to Morrison that the terrain felt channeled. The natural obstacles of the jungle seemed to be guiding them along a specific route, funneling them toward a destination of someone else's choosing. The question that hung in the humid air was whether they were walking into an ambush or just following the daily commute of the enemy. The answer arrived with terrifying suddenness. Sergeant First Class William Drake, the assistant patrol leader, took a step onto what looked like solid, moss-covered earth. The ground simply vanished beneath him. There was a sickening crack of breaking wood, followed immediately by a scream that shattered the jungle silence. Drake had plunged 8 feet down into a concealed pit, landing on a bed of sharpened bamboo stakes. The patrol froze, weapons snapping outward, fingers whitening on triggers, waiting for the crack of sniper fire or the chatter of a machine gun. But the jungle remained indifferent. Only the echoes of Drake's pain bounced off the trees. The men rushed to the edge of the pit. Drake was alive, writhing in the mud below, the bamboo stakes having pierced his legs and lower back. These were punji stakes, a vicious staple of jungle warfare. Bamboo hardened by fire until it was stronger than oak, sharpened to needle points, and often smeared with animal feces to ensure infection. Drake needed immediate evacuation. As the medics scrambled to stabilize him, Whitehorse dropped into the pit, avoiding the spikes with practiced ease. He was not looking at the wounded man. He was looking at the trap itself. He ran a hand over the bamboo and the earthen walls. When he climbed back out, his expression was grim but strangely hopeful. "This trap is old," Whitehorse announced. 3 months, maybe more. Look at the weathering on the stakes. The rain has eroded the sides of the pit. No one has maintained this. Morrison stared at him, trying to process the information through the haze of adrenaline. "What does that mean, Sergeant?" "It means they are comfortable," Whitehorse said, looking up toward the peaks. "They dug this when they first arrived to secure their perimeter. But they have not seen an enemy in so long they stopped checking it. They have forgotten it is here. They think they are safe." It was a crucial insight. The enemy was not on high alert. They were complacent. But the situation was critical. Drake could not walk, and carrying him out would require half the squad. Morrison made the hard tactical choice. He would take Drake and 3 men back to link up with the reinforcements. Whitehorse would continue forward with a skeleton reconnaissance team of 5 men. It was a dangerous gamble, splitting a small force in hostile territory. But as Whitehorse led his small band of ghosts deeper into the twilight, the realization that the enemy felt safe gave them a new kind of courage. They were not just soldiers anymore. They were the surprise that was coming for the sleeping giant. The reconnaissance team moved through the jungle with the silence of a held breath. Whitehorse led them not in a straight line, but in a tightening spiral, a path designed to skirt the peripheral vision of any sentries watching the approaches. The terrain had shifted from mud to jagged limestone, the teeth of the Finisterre Range, which made silent movement agonizingly difficult. Every step had to be tested, every loose stone accounted for before weight was applied. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, they found the anomaly that gave the game away. It was not a footprint or a broken twig this time. It was the air itself. Private First Class O'Brien, whose background in construction had given him an eye for structural oddities, grabbed Whitehorse's shoulder and pointed toward a cluster of boulders about 40 yards uphill. "Heat," he whispered, barely audible. "Look at the air." Above the gray stones, the air was shimmering, an oily, wavering distortion like a mirage on a hot highway. In the cooling evening jungle, such localized heat was impossible naturally. Whitehorse approached with the caution of a man dismantling a bomb. He reached out, his hand hovering inches above the rock. It was radiating warmth. Closer inspection revealed the genius of the engineering. The boulders were actually constructed of wire mesh and concrete, shaped and painted to match the surrounding limestone perfectly. Beneath them lay a steel pipe, capped with a diffuser to scatter the exhaust. It was a ventilation shaft. O'Brien realized the implications immediately. To require a vent this size, forcing this much hot air to the surface, the facility below had to be running heavy machinery, likely diesel generators, to power lights and air filtration systems. This was not a bunker. It was an underground city. Spreading out, the team located 4 more concealed shafts within a 100-yard radius. They were standing on top of the enemy, separated only by 30 feet of rock and soil. Whitehorse radioed the coordinates to Morrison, who was now guiding the heavy reinforcement column toward their position. The order came back: hold position, observe, and do not engage. As darkness swallowed the jungle, Whitehorse established an observation post on a ridge overlooking a steep, vegetation-covered depression that the ventilation shafts seemed to encircle. The night was a torture of insect bites and tense muscles, every rustle of a leaf sounding like an approaching patrol. Then the mountain breathed. It began as a subtle shift in the landscape. Corporal Sullivan, staring through his binoculars at a hillside about 200 yards away, nudged Whitehorse. "The trees," he whispered. "They are moving wrong." On a hillside where the air was dead still, a massive section of the slope trees, bushes, vines, and all shuddered. Slowly, with a grinding rumble of heavy chains that was barely muffled by the earth, the hillside split open. It was a masterpiece of camouflage engineering, a massive steel door, perhaps 30 feet wide and 20 feet high, faced with deep soil boxes containing living plants. It swung outward on titanic hydraulic hinges, transforming a sheer cliff face into a gaping maw. Light spilled from the opening, electric light, harsh and yellow, cutting through the jungle gloom. The smell of diesel fuel and cooking rice wafted up to the observation post. 2 Japanese soldiers stepped out, lighting cigarettes, their postures relaxed. They had no idea that 6 pairs of American eyes were watching them from the darkness above. Whitehorse watched through his optics, his face unreadable. He had tracked footprints in the mud to find a single man, but those footprints had led him to the mouth of a fortress carved into the living rock of the island. The scale of the deception was total. The Japanese had not just hidden in the jungle. They had built a mechanical world inside it, invisible to the planes flying overhead, invisible to the patrols walking past. But they had forgotten that even a mountain of steel needs to breathe, and even the most perfect lie leaves a trace in the air. Dawn broke over the Finisterre Range, turning the gray mist into a blinding white vapor. From their concealed ridge, Whitehorse and his team watched as the jungle woke up, but their eyes remained fixed on the artificial hillside. Colonel Hayes had arrived during the night with the main force, positioning 3 infantry platoons and a combat engineer team in a tightening noose around the facility's entrance. They were ready to blow the doors and storm the interior, But at 10:00 hours, the mountain opened again, and the plan fell apart. A column of people emerged from the tunnel, blinking in the morning light. They were not soldiers. They were civilians, 14 men and women, local villagers, their frames gaunt and clothes hanging in tatters. They carried woven baskets and tools, moving with the shuffling gait of exhausted and terrified. 3 Japanese soldiers supervised them, but loosely. There were no shackles. These were impressed laborers, likely forced to tend the hidden gardens that Whitehorse had found earlier. Colonel Hayes lowered his binoculars, cursing softly. The presence of civilians transformed a straightforward assault into a tactical nightmare. A firefight at the entrance would almost certainly result in a massacre of non-combatants. The order to hold fire was passed down the line. The Americans watched as the ghosts of the mountain went to work, unwitting human shields protecting the Empire's secrets. The waiting game stretched through the humid afternoon. It was not until dusk, when the laborers were herded back inside and the massive door hissed shut, that Hayes made his move. Under the cover of darkness, combat engineers crept forward, placing shaped charges near the hinges not to destroy the door, but to disable the locking mechanism if necessary. Loudspeakers were positioned in the trees. At 05:00 hours, the jungle silence was shattered not by artillery, but by a voice. Sergeant Tanaka took the microphone, his voice booming through the damp air in flawless Japanese. "You are surrounded by a superior force. Resistance is futile. We know you have civilians. Send them out and surrender, and you will be treated with honor." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. 15 minutes, ticked by an eternity in combat time. Every American soldier tightened their grip on their rifle, expecting the hillside to erupt in machine gun fire. Instead, the hydraulic groan returned. The door cracked open, and a single figure stepped out into the pre-dawn gloom. He wore the uniform of a lieutenant, his sword at his hip, but his hands were raised. This was Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, the architect of the deception. Through Tanaka, he negotiated swiftly. He offered a trade, the facility and the surrender of his garrison in exchange for the guaranteed safe passage of the civilians back to their village. It was a strange moment of chivalry in a brutal war, an acknowledgement that the game was up and further bloodshed was pointless. When the Americans finally entered the facility an hour later, the scale of what Whitehorse's tracking had uncovered left them speechless. It was a hollow earth, a completely self-contained world carved from the volcanic rock. The air inside was cool and smelled of ozone, diesel, and cured tobacco, a jarring contrast to the rotting stench of the jungle outside. The complex extended 400 feet into the mountain. It was not just a bunker. It was a logistics hub. They found cavernous storage bays stacked to the ceiling with crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and enough canned food to feed a regiment for 6 months. In a war defined by starvation and supply shortages, this was a treasure trove. There were concrete floors, drainage systems, and a radio room with transmitters powerful enough to reach the Philippines. But the most haunting discovery was in the personal quarters. The soldiers found shelves of books, musical instruments, and letters waiting to be mailed. The 97 Japanese soldiers who surrendered had not just been hiding. They had been living comfortable and secure, confident in their invisibility. They had built a perfect sanctuary, protected by the most advanced camouflage engineering of the war. They had accounted for aerial recon, thermal signatures, and local informants. They had thought of everything. Everything except a single Apache tracker who knew that even a man walking backward leaves a story in the mud. The facility that had taken the Japanese engineers 7 months to carve out of the mountain took the Allied combat engineers less than 4 hours to destroy. Demolition charges were placed on the structural pillars of the main cavern, and with a muffled thump that shook the jungle floor for miles, the hollow earth collapsed in on itself. The massive camouflage door, twisted off its hinges by the blast, was left to rust in the rain, a tombstone for a secret that had been kept too well. But while the physical base was gone, the intelligence gathered from Lieutenant Yamamoto's command center proved weaponizable. The maps and codebooks found inside the radio room peeled back the veil of Japanese operations across the entire Finisterre Range. In the weeks that followed, Allied forces used this data to pinpoint 6 other hidden supply depots. Military historians would later estimate that Whitehorse's discovery shortened the New Guinea campaign by at least 3 weeks, saving hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Allied lives. For James Whitehorse, the aftermath brought a kind of recognition he neither sought nor enjoyed. He was awarded the Silver Star in a ceremony at Port Moresby. Photographs from the event show him standing stiffly, his face impassive, surrounded by smiling officers. When a war correspondent pushed a microphone in his face, asking how he had outsmarted modern technology, Whitehorse did not boast. He simply quoted his grandfather, "Deception is a form of truth. It reveals what a man wishes to hide by the very effort he takes to hide it." The impact of the Ghost Patrol rippled far beyond that single operation. The report filed by Colonel Hayes made its way up the chain of command, sparking a shift in tactical doctrine. The US military began to actively recruit and deploy tracking specialists from various indigenous backgrounds, realizing that in the dense theaters of the Pacific, the oldest skills were often superior to the newest radios. The men who walked that trail carried the jungle home with them, each in their own way. Private Chun returned to San Francisco and became a high school history teacher, often telling his students that the most important things in history are usually found in the footnotes, the small signs that others miss. Corporal Sullivan returned to his Iowa farm. He wrote a letter to Whitehorse in 1951, thanking him for teaching him to see the land, not just look at it. Sergeant Tanaka, forever changed by the civilized surrender of Lieutenant Yamamoto, spent his life working in diplomatic relations, trying to bridge the gap between 2 nations that had once tried to annihilate each other in the mud. And James Whitehorse went home to the high desert of Arizona. He declined offers to teach at military survival schools or join the nascent special forces. Instead, he returned to his father's ranch, trading the jungle for the sagebrush. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking of the war. In 1968, a historian finally tracked him down for an interview. Whitehorse, then a weathered man in his late 40s, was asked if he ever doubted himself that day in the mud, if he ever worried the backward footprint was just a mistake. Whitehorse smiled, a rare expression that lit up his eyes. In tracking, he said, "There is no such thing as chance. A man walking backward is fighting against the earth. He is trying to reverse time, to undo his passage. But the earth always remembers the weight of a man." The Japanese had built a miracle of engineering, a fortress that fooled the cameras of reconnaissance planes and the eyes of West Point officers. But they could not fool the ground itself, and they could not fool a man who knew how to listen to it. Today, the site of the base is reclaimed by the jungle. The vines have swallowed the rusted metal, and the trees have grown over the collapsed tunnels. But the lesson remains, no secret is perfect, and truth often hides in the smallest, most backward of places. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you the most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history.